Well, I do think that he has decided to state his position as per his understanding of what ANC position was, therefore throwing down the gauntlet such that when they go to the NGC, the party will decide whether to affirm the position that was taken or it will decide to dilute it in any other form.
I suppose one thing it does is it might force Ace Magashule or his supporters to now take on the president in public. That would be quite difficult to do.
Well, ANC has been used to that kind of a public spat going back to 2005 up until now. The issue of taking on the president openly, even when people are in the top six, has become a common practice. And one thing one can take for the ANC is its ability to deal with these contradictions and still march forward.
There's a little bit of honesty fairly early on in the statement when it talks about that. It talks about infighting and the lack of unity. I mean, honesty is helpful in these situations. It's honest. It's helpful, I think, to be honest with voters and with the country that this is a problem. But the ANC has been honest about this problem, well, since Nasrec, and yet it's still not able to solve it. I mean, it requires more than honesty, doesn't it?
Certainly, here ANC now is stuck in a situation where its diagnosis is always correct if you analyze the political statement of its presidents and secretary generals in most of the successive conferences. They do highlight these problems, some of its internal investigations. But what is lacking is the political courage to deal with these issues decisively. And also, this is often raised as a question of trying to maintain unity. And here the problem is now unity is being maintained at the expense of some of the core foundational principles of the party itself.
I suppose we shouldn't forget, and it's easy to forget because it's the president who delivers it, but if I remember it correctly, this is actually a statement of the National Executive Committee itself. And it says in the statement, for example, that the party cannot focus on the past and on its record. It has to focus on delivering. It has to focus on the present. That is true, isn't it? I mean, people used to talk about, I think the phrase used at the time was the liberation dividend of the ANC. Is that dividend beginning to run out for the party?
I do think that it is beginning to be very difficult, especially for the younger generations, as well as the older ones who are seeing the promises of liberation waning, whilst corruption reported amongst the leadership and some of the lifestyle of the leadership is out there for everyone to see, especially with the Zondo Commission and other investigations which are exposed in the media and elsewhere. So that particular honeymoon of transition is over, and the narrative where you extract history in order to insulate itself may not last for too long. The ANC will have to prove that it can deliver on the promises going forward.
I mean, again, it's easy to say that. It's very hard to do. I mean, this is a campaigning document in a way. There's nothing wrong with that. It's allowed to be. There's a promise of cheaper electricity and reduced cost of living, for example. I have to say, I can't see that happening in 2021. I realize it's an election year. We've got local government elections. I just can't see any of those things happening.
The fiscal crisis and the economic crisis in the country makes many of the promises being made almost elusive in many ways. Something drastic, something radical has to take place for even some of the changes to take place. Here is the main problem. The crisis of leadership and the incapacity of state institutions to deliver on most of the policies makes any promise of implementation less credible. So here there is a believability and a credibility crisis whenever promises are being made. But the problem might even be larger than that. Other political formations may have made some promises, and we seem to have problems for those which are in power. For example, the albatross around the racial stigma of the DA and some of its experiences of corruption in places like such as Tshwane may have convinced people that not only the ANC but the political class itself is prone to some of these problems.
So, I mean, what you have when you talk about issues within state capacities, you have the growing credibility gap between what is promised and what can actually possibly be done. You have people who are getting poorer, they're feeling poorer, certainly. You have huge issues with the standards of education, for example. You have more and more anger and frustration. I mean, Professor, it's not a great picture at the start of the year. I mean, it really looks like we're in for a rough ride.
Well, I do think that what is very important now is some level of honesty amongst the leaders to say we are going to be in a crisis for some time and that we are going to try and change the way we've been doing things so that we can get out of this. People do understand when you're honest with them about the challenges and the time it will take, the sacrifices that will be made. But that in itself can only happen if you become exemplary and if they see the leadership being ethical in a sense, because they do not want to tighten their belts and only to realize that leaders are actually using elastic belts around themselves. That is where the problem is and the social distance comes.
And then, I mean, it takes us straight back to issues of corruption in a way where we started, or alleged corruption. I mean, for example, the idea that people connected to the ANC in some way seem to be making a profit at the start of the pandemic from PPE procurement. I mean, that's just an impossible situation for a political party in an election year.
Certainly, without any doubt, any promise you make, if you have integrity and credibility challenges because people suspect that you may steal anything that comes, then you have a problem there because whatever is being promised, whether land redistribution or vaccination or any other thing, people will always say there is a possibility that, again, patronage networks will try to trim this one off. And that is why it is very important for fight against corruption to take place, irrespective of who is involved, such that credibility comes back, integrity and ethics comes back into the space of governance. Then people can absorb any difficulty when they know that transparently these are the challenges which are there. They are not superficially created because some monies have been taken away.
I mean, in a way, I mean, then there is a plan, if I've understood it correctly, to try and vaccinate something like 40 million South Africans by the end of the year. If the ANC government is able to administer that and manage it, and it would probably involve help from the private sector, medical aids, private medical aids, etc., I mean, it could come out shining. I mean, it could completely change people's view of the movement.
It would assist. Remember that sometimes when ANC score a goal, it is usually the other own goals that come back. When the COVID-19 restrictions started and the fight against COVID, it was a unique opportunity for government to shine. It was receiving praise from abroad and everywhere. Then came the corruption scandal on the PPE. Again, in this particular case, until and unless you deal with the issue of corruption, with the issue of professionalizing state capacity and strong leadership, you run a risk of any positive being nullified by a negative that may occur along the way. Remember, corruption didn't know any boundaries, including funerals of Mandela. They had become a frenzy feeding scheme.
There's so many different things to talk about when it comes to the pandemic, but I would like to sort of ask this question because I think it's possibly fundamental to all of 2021, which is you would like to think as a governing party, as the leader of a governing party, or as the leadership rather of the governing party, so I'm talking about the NEC of the ANC now, Professor, that you would be able to kind of shape events, push the country in a certain direction. Is it possible, actually, that 2021, like 2020, because of the pandemic, nothing is controllable, and in fact, the pandemic is going to shape the year and not the ANC?
Well, there are many mega trends which are beginning to shape not only South Africa, but the world and the continent that we should also take into account as we try to factor in what South Africa can do and all its challenges. The first one, you do have major geopolitical changes around the world, which may even change the norms, the rules, and the institutions of multilateral organizations. The second one, you are beginning to see climate change, environmental degradation on a wide scale. That too is another mega trend which is happening irrespective of what government A or B is doing. The other one has been the free trade agreement. And come to South Africa, local government elections, National General Council of the ANC, the issue of vaccination and COVID-19, as well as the economy, are going to be the dominant factors come this year. How they are handled will determine whether we put the first building blocks for recovery or whether we put in, the slippery slope for further decline.
Professor Somadoda Fikeni, good to talk to you as always. Thank you very much indeed.